Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I am making this video as a response, this is like a 2-for-1, as a response to both Essence of Thought and Examining Evidence. Examining Evidence, if you haven't already seen his video, talked about the Canaanites, the slaughtering of the Canaanites, or as he put, the slaughtering of the Canaanites. And he actually defended, or tried to defend, the slaughtering of the Canaanites ethically. In a nutshell, Canaanites were horrible people. They sacrificed children, therefore, they deserve to get their crap kicked out of them. That's it in a nutshell. Essence of Thought comes along with a counter video and says, well, that's all well and good talking about the Canaanites, but what about the Midianites? The Midianites pretty much experience ethnic cleansing. Why don't we talk about that instead? I'm doing this video because their exchange is one that is, I would say, a typical exchange between literalist theists on one hand, examining evidence, and secular humanists, atheists, on the other hand. There's nothing wrong with these two positions, except that they typically do find much argument with each other. Essence of Thought clearly states in his video that while he's responding to examining evidence, he's also used to responding to Mission Dawah, and rightfully so. The Muslims of Mission Dawah typically fall under this classic literalistic theistic perspective. But I'm doing this video as a Swedenborgian, amongst other things, to not counter these perspectives, but to offer an alternative. Now, no doubt, people from both of the camps represented by examining evidence and Essence of Thought will find my video rather strange. They will probably think that it's just a bunch of nonsense, and let's just go back to arguing about the literalism of the text and whether we should just completely toss it out with a megalomaniacal god, one that's just condoning slaughter and genocide, and then let's just go back and just defend the heck out of this as an apologist. So this video is not actually meant for these two camps who are solid in their perspective about religion or metaphysics or the reading and understanding of scripture. This video is for people who, like me, watch this type of exchange, pop some popcorn, find it really fascinating, but don't necessarily read the Bible that way, or any scripture for that matter. Let me just turn down my phone here so we don't get another annoying beep. So, what's the difference then? I've mentioned in a number of my videos that there are different ways of reading the Bible. I actually did a video not that long ago addressing examining evidence, and he said he was going to make a video response to my video, but has not done so. Be curious to see if he ever does, but that's okay. I think that just by virtue of Essence of Thought and examining evidence doing this type of videos, it gives someone like myself a chance to kind of step in and offer up an alternative or a perspective that doesn't get a lot of airtime, like I've mentioned in my past videos. The non-literal interpretation of text, and people who favor that type of interpretation over the literal don't get a lot of airtime here on YouTube, nor in the common discourse. Because the loudest voices, the ones that have the most popularity, are the people who engage with the text literally. And it makes sense. The people who are literalists are engaged in policy making, discrimination. I can totally see from Essence of Thought why it would be important for him to joust with people like Mission Dawah or Examining Evidence, because they represent a particular population or community that reads the Bible literally and the Quran literally and has certain ideas based on a literal reading which many people could object to. So I actually don't see that as being a problem, as a point of focus. But yet it leaves many people like myself kind of sitting here going, well, that's all well and good, but what about our way of reading the text? That's the video I want to do today. So instead of dealing with a Canaanite issue, I'm actually going to take up where Essence of Thought left off, because in order of video responses, mine would be number 3, of course, unless anybody else has done a video on the subject since Essence of Thought. Examining Evidence did his first video, Essence of Thought did his response, and I'm responding now technically to Essence of Thought, but I feel like we're now in Inception, or Videoception, where I'm actually responding to both Essence of Thought and examining evidence. If you haven't seen either of their videos, I'll put the links to both of them below. I highly encourage you to do so. Even pause this video now, because I don't want to go over everything they mentioned, but I would encourage you to watch their videos. Welcome back. So, I'm actually referencing a book here called The Book of Numbers Explained by a British Swedenborgian. This book is so old, I don't even see a publication date, to be honest. But it is by the Reverend Henry McLaughlin, and he is doing a running commentary on the Book of Numbers. And I have a number of books like this. Swedenborg did a line-by-line commentary on Genesis, Exodus, and Revelation. In his other works, he mentions other parts of the Bible and how to understand them in reference to theological concepts or ideas, just interpreting the text for what they are. But there was a tradition amongst early Swedenborgian ministers to carry on the line-by-line commentary, chapter-by-chapter commentary that Swedenborg became famous for, or at least one thing he's famous for. And so this book is an attempt to carry on this type of interpretation, or the style of interpretation. Now, I'm starting with chapter 31 of the Book of Numbers, because this is what Essence of Thought offers up as an alternative to the Canaanites. He says that, and I'm not quoting verbatim, but it's like, he noticed a trend where Christians will only talk about the Canaanites, but they won't talk about the Midianites. And yet the Midianite slaughter arguably is a prime example of ethnic cleansing and destruction of a whole culture. So this is probably a good place to look to see what's the deal with this. Now, at the conclusion of the line-by-line commentary on chapter 31 of the Book of Numbers, the Reverend now offers an entire commentary on the chapter as a whole. Now, I'm not going to read the whole commentary because we'll be here for a while, but I'm going to jump around a little bit. But I want to start with this question, offer this idea. In my own denomination, Swedenborgians have there's an ongoing debate about how much credence should we give the literal text of the Bible. There are some who don't really care about the literal or historical meaning of the text. What they care about is they read the literal text, of course, because you would have to, but they're more interested, what is the spiritual interpretation? What is the psycho-spiritual interpretation? What's the mystical interpretation? Which Swedenborg said the Bible contains both the literal text and an internal meaning, an inner meaning that's beneath the manifest text. Now, so some Swedenborgians really favor the inner meaning. There are other Swedenborgians who, I don't want to say favor the literal text, but they will still wrestle with the text, and they will say, well, yeah, I mean, some of these things historically happened, at least as far as we can know, they historically happened, and so how do we deal with that? How do we as Swedenborgians approach this? How did Swedenborg approach these very same passages? Because Swedenborg dealt with the historical and then would examine the inner meaning. So how do we deal with a chapter like this as Swedenborgians? Do we fall into the apologetic role of saying, oh, well, they were sacrificing people to Moloch, or the Midianites, they were causing, they were enemies of God, and so the Israelites were doing God's will by wiping them out? Or do we take the other approach, the secular humanist approach, and just go, this is a great example of an evil God ordering these guys to do evil acts to justify their belief? Do we take one of these stances, or do we have an alternative? So what I'm going to offer is what the Reverend does, which he first deals with the historical. He doesn't brush it aside, but he offers a Swedenborgian theological position on the question of why. Why did this happen to the Midianites? Why did Moses feel that God was encouraging him and the Israelites to do this? And what's the spiritual interpretation as well? So there's two levels going on here. Another thing I need to mention, very brief, is that Swedenborg, like a number of other thinkers, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Aleister Crowley, etc., thought that man's spiritual understanding, or man's consciousness, humankind's consciousness, it has been changing and evolving since the beginning of our species. So early on in ancient civilizations, we viewed spirituality in a particular way, and this is changing and evolving until where we're at now, which we have a much more nuanced way of looking at symbolism, or Swedenborg basically would say that early on there was a view of looking at symbolism. We became very literalistic and obsessed with external things in the middle there, the ancient period, and then now we're hopefully moving back into more of a symbolic understanding of symbolism in Scripture. So we need to understand that if we're going to look at this historically, the Israelites were much more concerned with externals. They weren't that concerned with inner spirituality, meaning they didn't look at ideas or symbols as representing inner concepts, but more of a legalistic system. That is something that needs to be kept in mind, and this is important from a Swedenborgian point of view. So the Reverend says at the very beginning of his commentary that there's actually two truths in the Bible. There's the apparent and the genuine. The apparent is usually represented by the literal text, unless otherwise stated, and the genuine is the inner text. He says that both come from God. They both come from a metaphysical, infinite place, and yet he says very clearly on page 504 that there is a conundrum here, because you've got God, who is the New Testament God, saying the Sermon of the Mount, basically telling people don't seek revenge, but then you've got the God represented in the Old Testament as apparently ordering revenge. How do you reconcile these two things? What do you do with these two things? So he says here that we now see, therefore, that when the Lord instructed Moses to take vengeance on the Midianites, the command assumed an outward form, which it did in accommodation to the state of Moses and the Israelites, who were of such a character that they actually desired to take vengeance or to do evil to others who had done evil to them. So I want to be very clear here. Swedenborg and Swedenborgians look at the Bible as a very psychological text, almost like developmental psychology, which one of our scholars, George Dole, has done a whole book about reading the Bible as developmental psychology, spiritual psychology. This is not typically done. So I understand at this point if people are going to be like, wait, hold on, I call BS. Okay, but bear with me. Okay, I understand this is not a typical perspective. So what the minister is saying here is that this message, this idea of taking vengeance, assumed an outward form because Moses and the Israelites were in a certain state of mind when they got this message, when they got this idea from the divine. Okay, so they have a participation. We all, according to Swedenborg, have a participation when we receive a message from God. Okay, now the message is not like, hey, you should do this. Right? He explains what he calls influx and inflow, which comes up for all of us, and it's very psychological in terms of feelings or ideas that bubble forth from our unconscious, and how do we deal with that consciously? People who are into depth psychology would understand what I'm saying. Now, he then goes on to say that this command of the Lord, therefore, that is, of the same Lord that spoke the Sermon on the Mount, in its first procedure from him, was not a command to take vengeance at all, or to engage in war at all. But yet, in its descent from him, and now we're getting to metaphysics here, so warning, through all the heavens, and through the mind of the angel or spirit who spoke from the Lord to Moses, it assumed the outward appearance, which is here recorded and forms a part of the literal sense of the word. So let's pause there for a moment. So what the minister is saying is that in the Swedenborgian system, God doesn't just send instant messages. He doesn't just text someone and say, boom, here is this thought. The communication between the infinite and the finite is actually very complicated, because Swedenborg was not a traditional theist. Some Swedenborgians consider him to be a panentheist. Some consider him to be, obviously, a Christian mystic. More importantly, he was definitely influenced by the Neoplatonic view of cosmology and metaphysics. So, again, this is not a traditional way in which most atheists and theists nowadays argue about why does God justify things or how can God order these things. So Swedenborg and Swedenborgians are saying take a step back and looking at it as that the idea of whatever the message was between divine and finite goes through these intermediary stages. To Moses, it may have felt instantaneous, but you have to keep in mind what was Moses' psychology, what was his cultural understanding, and how was the message received and perceived by him through these layers, reaching back to the divine source. Big thing to keep in mind. Continuing, that is, it is an apparent truth and not a genuine truth. This is on page 505 now. And such, indeed, are all the truths of the word in which vengeance, anger, wrath, repentance, changes of mind, and other merely human weaknesses are attributed to the Lord. So these are not genuine truths, these negative attributions. These are apparent truths. And let's skip ahead now. So then he then gives a number of examples of genuine and apparent truths. But I want to go on now to going on to page 506, where it says here, the presence of heavenly light and life discloses the imperfection and aversion of the yet not fully regenerated man. For the love of falsifying the truth still remains, and thus we learn how very gradual is man's progress in the higher life. And here we may pause to think for a moment of the actual historical facts. So the author here, the Reverend here, is saying that it's a process of spiritual growth, of consciousness, to understand better the inflow of any sort of message from the divine, and that it's very obvious that the Israelites here represent a non-regenerated state, which means they were not totally aware or able to perceive messages from the divine in a clear sense. So moving on, looking at the historical facts. Moses commands the slaughter of every male among the little ones and all the married women of the captive Midianites. Moving on to 506. How cruel were those wars of the Israelites! War is at all times a curse and not a blessing. And the very spirit of cruelty and revenge lurks in the minds both of the leaders and of the soldiers who engage in war, however apparently just may seem to be the reasons for the conflict. Hence, then, cruel and destructive warfare can never be justified. And if modern wars are in some respects not so bad, in this respect, as were those of ancient nations, yet it still remains absolutely true that all wars have an evil origin, are contrary to the spirit of true religion, inevitably foster, encourage, and stimulate the worst of evil passions. No wonder, therefore, that the best conditions of mankind in the past are described as times of mutual love and peace and prosperity, when no selfishness was predominant, and that the best conditions of the future shall be the return of the golden age, when men shall, quote, beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, when, quote, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war any more, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. Then the minister says, for now, on the other hand, turning to the interpretation according to the correspondences, the symbolic interpretation, we realize how holy and pure is the word in its spiritual sense. For the command given by Moses in that sense is of the greatest value and ought to be strictly carried out by every member of the church. And the spiritual warrior should indeed separate from himself every incipient felicity or evil, and every delight in falsifying the truth for selfish purposes, while yet he must preserve in himself every affection of truth which is not contaminated with falsity, in addition to which it is necessary that impure state shall be distinguished carefully from the goods and truths of the church until regeneration is accomplished and man is altogether purified from evil. And then he goes on to describe the symbolic reading of the entire chapter, which I will not get into here. So what is this saying? This is saying that metaphysically, Moses and the Israelites were at a certain place in human history, in human consciousness, where the spiritual message was given, which was purify the good, get rid of the evil, in the process of spiritual regeneration and growth. But because of the Israelites at this time and place in history, they could not actually see that the message, the pure, unadulterated message that originated with the divine, was telling them that this is a spiritual thing. This is a spiritual battle, not meant to actually literally happen. But because of their historical place and time, they did not understand that this was a spiritual message and took the message literally and externally, which led to these atrocious wars and genocide which should be repudiated and cannot be justified. Now, this is a perspective that, again, is not typical, and I admit this. And it is something that, again, Swedenborgians wrestle with themselves in terms of, I mean, this Reverend represents a very classical Swedenborgian approach to say that, yes, we admit that these things historically happened, but there is a theological, there's a metaphysical reason for why they happened, and that we can actually say that Moses and the Israelites did terrible things because they were not at the proper place to fully understand the actual, true, genuine spiritual message. They were not ready to receive this way of thinking because of their state of mind, their characterological necessities, their characters. So, this is a very psychological, social psychological, spiritual, if you will, interpretation of the text. Now, again, I can hear the objections. Well, what gives? Can't God just be like, hey, don't do this, guys. Don't do this to the Midianites. Can't he in his infinite wisdom stop these things? And I would say that, again, this type of question is posed to a classical theistic perspective, a very personal deity who interferes in human affairs very directly. And I would say that the arguments and counter-arguments to what I am talking about are going to come from those two perspectives, but now we're almost talking about two different languages here. The atheist, the theist, the Neoplatonist, the panentheist view these things very differently. And that's something that just needs to be kept in mind going forward in this type of conversation, if one wants to go forward with me in this conversation. But I want to offer this. Now, the other side of the Swedenborgian tradition just says, you know, we don't bother with looking at the literal text. We look at the entire Bible as a spiritual narrative that has symbolism. This would be a very Jungian perspective, a very Joseph Campbell perspective. This is a very symbolic, purely symbolic perspective. That's another way of doing it. And now I can hear people saying, oh, well, that's just a cop-out. Now you're just totally ignoring the potential historical context. And I would say that, yeah, it could be perceived as being a cop-out. But people who are going to read the text are not just saying we need to ignore the historical ramifications of this, but I would say even people who read the symbolism of the text, or read the text in a purely symbolic way, could make the argument that, yeah, these wars were terrible, and that this represents, people, a sort of spiritual, psychological place where you are trying to get rid of the negative aspects of yourself and purify yourself spiritually and psychologically. So, I just want to offer these alternatives to viewers who are interested in the interpretation of text, because I'm not too concerned about whether I'm right or they're wrong, or that they're right and I'm wrong. But I feel like in topics like this, different perspectives should be represented. It shouldn't just be the theist versus the atheist who should be able to engage with this text. And this is why I was inspired to make the video. No doubt this is not going to be the last video on this particular subject. I'm sure I'll be doing other videos about Swedenborgian interpretation moving forward. It's a good thing that starting in the fall, I'll be starting seminary. to become a Swedenborgian minister, and I'm sure I'll have plenty of opportunities to learn more about my own tradition and how the Bible is read. In fact, I know one of the classes, two-part class that I'll have to take is biblical exegesis from a Swedenborgian perspective. So, goody, and I will be sharing through video the things that I learn in the future. So I hope this was not too confusing. I'm sure some of you are probably like, right. But that's cool. Thank you for taking the time, 25 minutes out of your life, to watch this video and consider an alternative to viewing the biblical text. Thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.